There's a photograph that exists in only one copy. It was taken in 1963, in a farmhouse outside Holloway, Kentucky. In it, 6 girls stand in a line, arranged by height. They're all between 8 and 16 years old. They're all wearing white dresses. And if you look closely, really closely, you'll notice something that makes your skin crawl. Every single one of them appears twice. The Holloway family had a tradition that no one outside the bloodline understood. Every daughter born to a Holloway woman came with a twin. Not sometimes. Not occasionally. Every single time. For 5 generations, stretching back to the 1880s, there had never been a singleton birth. The townspeople whispered about it in grocery store aisles and church basements. They called it a blessing. They called it a curse. They called it a lot of things, but never what it actually was. A genetic anomaly so statistically impossible that when doctors finally studied it in the early 2000s, they could find no medical explanation for why it kept happening. But this story isn't about the twins who lived. It's about the twin who was found dead on a spring morning in 1977, and what her sister discovered when she started asking questions no one in Holloway wanted answered. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The Holloway family didn't talk about their history. They didn't need to. In a town of 423 people, everyone already knew. The family lived on 160 acres of land that had been in their possession since 1882, when Mary Ann Holloway became the first woman to give birth to twin daughters in what would become an unbroken chain of identical pairs. The births happened with such regularity that by the 1940s, local midwives stopped being surprised. They simply prepared 2 of everything. But there was something else the townspeople knew, something they spoke about even less than the twins themselves. The Holloway daughters never left. Not for college, not for marriage, not for anything. They stayed on that property, generation after generation, living in a cluster of houses that grew like a small village within the Kentucky hills. And when they died, which they often did young, they were buried in a private cemetery at the edge of the property, marked with stones that bore only first names and years. No last names, no epitaphs, just names and dates, as if the family wanted to remember them but didn't want anyone else asking questions. On the morning of April 9th, 1977, 16-year-old Catherine Holloway woke up knowing something was wrong. She couldn't explain it then, and she never could explain it properly in the decades that followed, but she described it the same way every time someone asked. She said it felt like someone had reached inside her chest and torn out something vital, something she didn't know she needed until it was gone. She got out of bed, walked barefoot across the cold wooden floor of the bedroom she shared with her twin sister Margaret, and found Margaret's bed empty. The sheets were pulled back neatly, as if Margaret had intended to return. Her shoes were still by the door. Her jacket was still hanging on its hook, but Margaret herself was nowhere in the house. Catherine searched every room, calling her sister's name in a voice that started calm and grew increasingly frantic. Their mother, Eleanor, heard the commotion and came downstairs. When Catherine told her Margaret was missing, Eleanor's face did something Catherine had never seen before. It went completely blank, as if someone had wiped away every emotion and left only a smooth, empty surface. Eleanor didn't call the police. She called the other Holloway women. Within an hour, 14 women had gathered at the main house, mothers, aunts, cousins, all of them part of the endless chain of twins. They spread out across the property in pairs, moving through the woods and fields with a practiced efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time they'd searched for someone. Catherine wanted to go with them, but Eleanor grabbed her arm hard enough to leave bruises and told her to stay inside. So Catherine stood at the kitchen window and watched the women disappear into the morning fog that rose from the hollow behind the property, and she understood with absolute certainty that they weren't looking for Margaret because they thought she was lost. They were looking for her body. They found her at 11:43 in the morning, in the old root cellar that hadn't been used since the 1930s. The entrance was hidden beneath decades of overgrowth, accessible only if you knew exactly where to look. Margaret was lying on the earthen floor, her white nightgown spread around her like a shroud. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her eyes were closed. There were no signs of violence, no indication of struggle. She looked, according to the county coroner's report, like she had simply laid down and stopped breathing. She was 16 years old. She had been dead for approximately 6 hours, and she was the 7th Holloway twin to die in almost exactly the same way. The official cause of death was listed as cardiac arrhythmia, a sudden, unexplained stopping of the heart. It's what had been written on the death certificates of the other 6 girls who died before her, stretching back to 1929. The pattern was always the same. A twin would disappear in the night. The family would find her body somewhere on the property. There would be no explanation, no clear cause, just a young girl who had been alive one moment and inexplicably dead the next. The surviving twin would be examined by doctors, pronounced healthy, and would continue living, but something in her would be different, quieter, more distant, as if part of her had died too, but her body hadn't gotten the message. Catherine didn't speak for 3 days after they found Margaret. She sat in the chair by the window in their shared bedroom and stared at the empty bed across from her own. Family members brought her food she didn't eat. They spoke to her in soft voices she didn't acknowledge. On the 4th day, her mother came into the room and sat down on Margaret's bed, smoothing the blankets with hands that trembled slightly. "It's the way of things," Eleanor said. "It's always been the way of things." Catherine turned to look at her mother for the first time since Margaret had died. "What does that mean?" Eleanor was quiet for a long time. Outside, the April wind moved through the trees, making a sound like whispered warnings. Finally, Eleanor spoke, and her voice carried the weight of something she'd been holding back for years. "There's a price," she said, "for what we are, for what we've always been, and someone has to pay it." Catherine would later tell a researcher that this was the moment she stopped being a daughter and became an investigator. She started asking questions. She started digging into family records that had been kept in the attic of the main house for over a century. Birth certificates, death certificates, handwritten journals, letters that smelled like age and secrets. And what she found was a pattern so precise, so deliberate, that it couldn't possibly be coincidence. Since 1889, there had been 42 sets of twins born to Holloway women. Of those 42 sets, 7 had experienced the death of one twin before adulthood. But it wasn't random. The deaths occurred in a specific sequence, following a rule that no one had ever spoken aloud but everyone seemed to understand. In each generation, if there were multiple sets of twins, only one set would lose a member. And it was always the youngest set of twins in that generation. Margaret and Catherine had 3 older twin cousins. Margaret had been the youngest twin in their generation, and she had died at 16, just like the others before her. Catherine found the journals of her great-great-grandmother, Mary Ann Holloway, the woman who had started it all. The entries were written in fading ink, the handwriting elegant and precise. Mary Ann had given birth to twin daughters in 1882, at the age of 19. She wrote about the births with joy, calling her daughters her matched blessings, her perfect mirrors. But 10 years later, in 1892, the entries changed. "Sarah did not wake this morning," Mary Ann wrote on June 14, 1892. "We found her in the chapel, peaceful as if sleeping. The doctor says her heart simply stopped. But I know better. I know what we are. I know what was promised, and I know what must be given in return. My daughter paid the price, as daughters have paid before her, as daughters will pay after her. This is our covenant. This is our burden. And we do not speak of it to those outside the blood." Catherine read those words over and over, trying to understand what her great-great-grandmother meant. What covenant, what promise, what had been given, and what was being taken in return. She brought the journal to her mother and demanded answers. Eleanor looked at the pages, then looked at her daughter, and Catherine saw something she'd never seen in her mother's eyes before. Fear. "Some questions," Eleanor said, "are dangerous to ask." Catherine didn't stop asking questions. She couldn't. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Margaret's face, peaceful and lifeless, on that earthen floor. Every time she woke up, she reached across the space between their beds and found nothing. The absence of her twin was a physical thing, a hollow place in her chest that ached with every breath. And the more she dug into the family's past, the more she realized that her mother's fear wasn't about protecting Catherine. It was about protecting something much older, much darker, something the Holloway women had been guarding for over a century. She found a box in the attic that had belonged to her grandmother, Ruth Holloway, who had died in 1968. Inside were letters dating back to the early 1900s, correspondence between Holloway women and someone they only referred to as the Keeper. The letters were written in careful, formal language, but beneath the politeness was something that made Catherine's hands shake as she read. They were negotiating, trading. One letter from 1927, written by Ruth's mother, included a single chilling sentence. "We understand the terms remain unchanged. One life given, many lives blessed. We accept." Catherine showed the letters to her Aunt Vivian, who was 52 years old and had lost her own twin sister in 1943. Vivian read them in silence, her face growing paler with each page. When she finished, she handed them back to Catherine and said something that would haunt Catherine for the rest of her life. "Your mother told you some questions are dangerous. She was wrong. The questions aren't dangerous, the answers are." But Vivian told her anyway. She told her about the origin of the Holloway twins, a story that had been passed down through whispered conversations and deathbed confessions, never written down, never confirmed, but believed by every woman in the family. In 1881, Marianne Holloway had been barren. She'd been married for 3 years and had suffered 4 miscarriages. In a time when a woman's worth was measured by her ability to bear children, Marianne was desperate. So she did what desperate people have always done. She sought help from places respectable people don't go. There was a woman living in the hills above Holloway, Kentucky, someone the locals called Mother Shroud. She wasn't a midwife or a doctor. She was something older, something that had different names in different times but always meant the same thing. A woman who knew how to make bargains with forces that existed in the spaces between prayers and curses. Marianne went to her in the winter of 1881, and Mother Shroud told her she could help. But everything worth having has a cost, and the cost for what Marianne wanted was steep. "You want children," Mother Shroud had said, according to the story Vivian told. "I'll give you children. I'll give you more than you ever dreamed. Every daughter you bear will have a sister. Every daughter they bear will have a sister. Your bloodline will never be alone, never be singular, never be broken. But abundance demands sacrifice. Every generation, the youngest pair will offer one back, one life given, so that the others may continue. This is the bargain. This is the price." Marianne agreed. 6 months later, she gave birth to healthy twin daughters, and 10 years after that, one of them died in her sleep, peaceful and unexplained, in the same way Margaret would die 85 years later. Catherine sat with this information for weeks, trying to decide if she believed it, trying to decide if it mattered whether she believed it. Because belief or not, the pattern was real. The deaths were real. Margaret was dead, and 7 girls before her had died in exactly the same way, at exactly the same age, always from the youngest set of twins in their generation. The math was too precise to be coincidence. The history was too consistent to be natural. In 1978, Catherine Holloway did something no woman in her family had ever done. She left. She enrolled at the University of Kentucky, moved into a dormitory 3 hours away from the family property, and began studying forensic pathology. Her mother didn't speak to her for 6 months. Her aunts sent letters begging her to come home, warning her that leaving the bloodline was dangerous, that the covenant required proximity, that she was putting herself at risk by breaking tradition. Catherine ignored them all. She had decided that if her sister's death was part of some supernatural bargain, she needed to understand it. And if it wasn't, if there was a medical explanation, a genetic marker, something rational and provable, then she needed to find it. She spent 4 years earning her degree, then another 3 working as a medical examiner's assistant in Lexington. She studied every cardiac death of a young woman she could access, looking for patterns, commonalities, anything that might explain what had happened to Margaret and the others. She found nothing. No genetic markers, no environmental factors, no medical reason why healthy teenage girls should simply stop breathing in the middle of the night. In 1985, she requested access to Margaret's autopsy records and the records of the 6 girls who had died before her. What she found made her physically ill. The autopsies had all been performed by the same coroner, Dr. James Whitfield, who had served Holloway County from 1927 until his retirement in 1981. Dr. Whitfield had examined all 7 girls, and his reports were nearly identical, word for word, as if he'd simply copied the first one and changed the names and dates. Cardiac arrhythmia, no signs of trauma, no evidence of disease, natural causes. But when Catherine looked deeper into Dr. Whitfield's background, she discovered something that made her hands shake. Dr. Whitfield had inherited his position from his father, who had inherited it from his father. The Whitfield family had been county coroners since 1894. And Dr. Whitfield's grandmother had been a Holloway. She drove back to Holloway, Kentucky, for the first time in 8 years, and knocked on the door of Dr. Whitfield's son, Robert, who had taken over his father's practice. Robert Whitfield was in his 60s, a quiet man with tired eyes, who looked at Catherine like he'd been expecting her for years. She asked him about the autopsy reports. She asked him what his father had really known, and Robert Whitfield did something she didn't expect. He started crying. "My father made me promise never to tell," he said, "but I'm old now, and the keeping of secrets has cost me more than the telling ever could." He told her that his father had known exactly what was happening to the Holloway girls, that every time one of them died, there were signs the autopsy reports never mentioned. Their hearts hadn't just stopped, they'd been drained, not of blood, but of something else, something Dr. Whitfield couldn't measure or name but could see in the tissue samples under his microscope. He described it as a kind of emptiness, as if the cells themselves had been hollowed out, their vital essence removed. Dr. Whitfield had documented this in private notes he kept separate from the official records, notes he'd shown to his son shortly before his death. And in those notes, he'd written a single sentence that Robert had memorized: "They are not dying, they are being taken." If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Catherine asked to see the private notes. Robert told her his father had burned them in 1980. Shortly after Margaret's death, shortly after Catherine had left for college. But he remembered one other thing his father had discovered. In 1976, the year before Margaret died, Dr. Whitfield had traveled to the old property where Mother Shroud had lived, the place where Marianne Holloway had supposedly made her bargain. The house was long gone, collapsed into the earth decades earlier, but there was something still there, something Dr. Whitfield had found buried beneath the ruins. Robert didn't know what it was. His father had never told him, but after that trip, Dr. Whitfield had come home different, quieter, more afraid. Catherine went to the ruins alone on a grey morning in November of 1985. She told no one where she was going. She brought a shovel, a flashlight, and copies of every document she'd collected over the past 8 years. The location was marked on an old survey map from 1879, a plot of land 2 miles north of the Holloway property, accessible only by an overgrown logging road that hadn't been maintained in half a century. When she finally reached the site, she understood why no one had returned there. The place radiated wrongness. That's the only word she could find for it in the journal she kept. Not danger, not fear, but wrongness, as if the land itself remembered what had happened there and resented anyone who came looking. The foundation of Mother Shroud's house was still visible, 4 walls of stacked stone slowly being reclaimed by moss and earth. Catherine walked the perimeter twice before she found what Dr. Whitfield must have found: a section of stone that had been disturbed, then carefully replaced. She began digging. 3 feet down, her shovel struck something that wasn't earth. She cleared away the soil with her hands and found a wooden box, about the size of a small trunk, sealed with tar, and wrapped in chains that had rusted but not broken. It took her 40 minutes to break the chains with a hammer she'd brought from her truck. When she finally opened the box, she found something that made her understand why Dr. Whitfield had burned his notes and never spoken of what he'd discovered. Inside were 7 bundles of cloth, each one carefully wrapped and tied with string. Catherine opened the first bundle with trembling hands. Inside was a lock of hair, blonde and fine, tied with a ribbon that had faded to gray. Beneath it was a piece of paper with a name written in careful script: Sarah Holloway, 1892. She opened the others, one by one. Margaret's was the last bundle, the cloth still relatively new, the hair still holding its color. Beneath each lock of hair was a small glass vial, and inside each vial was something that looked like water but moved wrong, Too thick, too slow, catching the light in ways that water doesn't. Catherine held Margaret's vial up to the grey November sky and felt something she hadn't felt since the morning they'd found her sister's body. That sensation of something being torn from inside her chest. The vials weren't filled with water. They were filled with something that had been taken from the girls when they died. Something essential. Something that made them who they were. At the bottom of the box, beneath all the bundles, was a book. Not a journal or a ledger, but something older, bound in leather that had cracked with age. The pages were covered in handwriting that changed every few entries, different hands from different eras, but all writing the same thing: a record, a registry. Every Holloway twin birth since 1882 was listed, along with dates and names, and next to the youngest set of twins in each generation, there was a notation, a mark. Catherine recognized it from books on folklore she'd studied in college. It was a binding sigil, the kind used in old contracts to mark what had been promised and what had been claimed. The final entry was in handwriting Catherine recognized, her mother's. It was dated April 8th, 1977, the night before Margaret had died. The youngest pair has been marked. Eleanor had written, Margaret, Catherine Holloway, 16 years. The debt will be collected at dawn. The covenant continues. Catherine sat in the ruins of Mother Shroud's house and understood with absolute clarity what her family had been doing for over a century. They hadn't just accepted the deaths of their daughters, they'd been facilitating them. Each generation, the women of the family would mark the youngest twins, perform some ritual Catherine didn't yet understand, and ensure that the bargain was kept. One life given, many lives blessed. The mothers were sacrificing their daughters to maintain the abundance of twins, to keep the bloodline strong, to honor a promise made by a desperate woman over 100 years ago. Catherine took the box. She loaded it into her truck, drove back to the Holloway property, and walked into the main house where 14 women were gathered for Sunday dinner. She placed the box on the dining room table, opened it, and spread the contents in front of her mother, her aunts, her cousins. The room went silent. Eleanor stood up slowly, her face pale, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "You don't understand what you've done," Eleanor said, her voice barely a whisper. "I understand exactly what I've done," Catherine replied. "I found the evidence. I found the ritual. I found Margaret's hair and her essence in a box buried like treasure. You've been killing your own daughters for 5 generations, and I'm going to make sure it stops." What happened next isn't entirely clear, because Catherine Holloway's account is the only one that exists, and even she admits there are gaps in her memory, moments that don't line up, sensations she can't properly describe. What is clear is that when she confronted her family with the contents of that box, something changed in the air of that room. The temperature dropped, the windows rattled in their frames despite there being no wind, and Eleanor Holloway, who had spent 16 years keeping secrets from her daughter, finally told the truth. The ritual wasn't optional. It had never been optional. When Marianne Holloway made her bargain with Mother Shroud in 1881, she hadn't just agreed to sacrifice 1 twin per generation. She had bound the entire bloodline to that covenant, woven it into their very existence. The twins weren't a gift, they were a requirement. The abundance of daughters, the perfect pairing, the unbroken chain of sisters, all of it depended on the sacrifice being made. If a generation refused, if the debt wasn't paid, the bargain would collapse. And when it collapsed, Eleanor said, it wouldn't just stop future twins from being born. It would take back what had already been given. Catherine asked what that meant. Her mother's answer was simple and terrible. Everyone dies. Every twin born from Marianne's bloodline. All at once. That's what happens when you break a covenant this old. The women in that room, 14 of them, ranging from 23 to 68 years old, all understood what Catherine had just done by taking the box, by exposing the ritual, by refusing to accept the terms. She had put all of their lives at risk. Some of them begged her to return the box to its burial place. Some of them screamed at her, called her selfish, called her a murderer. But a few of them, the ones who had lost their twins, the ones who had lived with that hollow space in their chests for decades, said nothing. They just looked at Catherine with something that might have been hope or might have been resignation. Catherine made a decision that night that would define the rest of her life. She took the box to the private cemetery at the edge of the property, the place where all the sacrificed twins were buried. She dug 7 small holes in front of 7 graves, and she buried each bundle of hair and each vial of stolen essence with the girl it had been taken from. She spoke their names aloud: Sarah, Elizabeth, Rebecca, Constance, Ruth, Dorothy, Margaret, and she told them she was sorry. Sorry that desperate women had made bargains they couldn't keep. Sorry that daughters had paid for promises they never made. Sorry that tradition and fear had turned mothers into executioners. When she returned the book to the box and sealed it again, she didn't bury it. She burned it. She built a fire in the cemetery and watched the leather binding curl and blacken, watched the pages with their careful records and binding sigils turn to ash. The flames burned green for a moment, then white, then went out completely, leaving nothing but smoke that smelled like copper and wet earth. Nothing happened. No lightning strike, no sudden deaths, no collapsing of the covenant. The women waited through the night, expecting catastrophe, but dawn came quiet and ordinary. In the weeks that followed, Catherine waited for consequences, but none came. The Holloway twins continued living. No new deaths, no mysterious cardiac arrests. The pattern, after 95 years, had simply stopped, but something else stopped too. After Catherine's confrontation in 1985, no more twins were born to Holloway women. The youngest generation, Catherine's cousins who were still of childbearing age, all had singleton births, or no children at all. The abundance that had defined the family for over a century ended as abruptly as it had begun. The covenant was broken, but so was the gift. The Holloway women had spent 5 generations sacrificing their daughters to maintain something that, in the end, couldn't survive the truth being spoken aloud. Catherine Holloway lived the rest of her life alone. She never married. She never had children. She continued working as a forensic pathologist until her retirement in 2009, and she spent her free time documenting what had happened to her family, creating a record that she donated to the Kentucky Historical Society with instructions that it not be opened until 20 years after her death. She died in 2019. At the age of 58, of the same cardiac arrhythmia that had taken her sister 42 years earlier. The doctors called it a tragic coincidence. Her family knew better. The thing about old bargains is that they don't disappear just because you stop honoring them. They linger, they wait, they remember. And sometimes, late at night in the hills of Holloway, Kentucky, people still report seeing 2 identical girls walking hand in hand through the woods, wearing white dresses that glow in the moonlight. They never speak, they never stop, they just walk, endlessly searching for something that was taken from them, something they'll never find, because the debt has been paid and the covenant is broken. But the ghosts of what was sacrificed don't know how to rest. The Holloway property still stands, though no one from the family lives there anymore. The last of them sold it in 2015 to a developer who planned to turn it into luxury homes. But construction never started. Workers reported feeling watched. Equipment malfunctioned, and more than one person claimed to hear voices in the cemetery at dawn, young girls calling for their sisters, asking why they had to die, asking if anyone remembered their names. This is the story no one in Holloway, Kentucky wants you to know. The story of daughters who paid for promises they never made, of mothers who chose abundance over love, of a bargain that lasted 5 generations and cost 7 lives before someone finally said enough. Catherine Holloway broke the covenant, but she couldn't undo what had already been done. The dead stay dead, the taken stay taken. And somewhere in the hills of Kentucky, 7 girls are still waiting for someone to answer the question they asked when they were alive. Why us? Why did it have to be us? If you made it this far, you're part of a very small group who can handle the truth buried in America's dark corners. Leave a comment and let us know what you think really happened to the Holloway twins. And remember, some family traditions are kept for a reason, and some are kept because no one has the courage to stop them. Until next time.